Hi, my name is Lisa Heidle, and this is Cristine Seidell,
Yeah.
and we are the Ego Project.
Yay. All things ego.
We are exploring the ego together and with our listeners to kind of get a better understanding of what the ego is and how we can make the ego work for us instead of the ego running us. So I am an author and a workshop leader and an entrepreneur and a lifetime seeker of information, knowledge, self improvement, growth, self-development, and all that good stuff. So, and Cristine?
Absolutely. And I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Georgia. I too am an entrepreneur and just like Lisa, a lifetime learner. So, even though this is in the wheelhouse of therapy, something that I am super excited about is partnering with Lisa, who is so eloquent and so articulate in so many different capacities, but this is something that we've really connected on. And as we've started talking, realized, hey, this is a message that I think a lot of people out there are interested in and that are looking to learn and develop and grow from in and of themselves. So the Ego Project is from the perspective of a trained psychotherapist, but also that of a layperson. What are the experiences we have within our own world, regardless if we're professionally trained or we're just navigating, relationships, friendships, and partnerships with people in our workplace and our world. So welcome. We are super excited to have you watching and listening to what we are looking to explore. Really, it's an exploration of something that we all are experiencing every single day without even being fully conscious of it. So with that, Lisa, can we start with you?
Great. Well, actually, we're going to start with you. I'm going to throw
Okay.
you some questions.
Okay.
And we're going to start with the one that's on everyone's mind, obviously, is what is the ego? The word has been thrown around so much. It's definitely part of our cultural vernacular. People know it through different thought leaders and spiritual leaders, and of course, CEOs, in the corporate world, it's used everywhere. But I think there's a real misunderstanding of what it is. So I'm going to let you talk about what it is through the therapeutic model. And then I'll share after that how I perceive it as a layperson,
Sure.
and how it shows itself in myself as well as in how you identify it in others. So I'll let you go ahead and take that. So what is the ego, Cristine?
Well, and I love that you just brought that up. Like so many things within mental health have been, used, and its terminology has been so misinterpreted. And, honestly, in so many negative capacities, right? So, even things like, you're so bipolar, or, you're crazy, or you're so histrionic. Ego is another one of those, concepts of mental health that literally gets thrown about. Right. But ego is such a part of who we are. It is literally so much and yet nothing at all. Right. So the ego is not something you're going to find within our bodies. Right. So, if we were to do a biopsy of our body or go looking for the ego, we're not going to find it like we will the brain or the heart or the liver, but the ego is basically this driver of everything that we think, we see, and we do. Right. So does the collective of our experiences, from the very, very early stages of childhood, from the moment we're born to where we show up here in the present. The ego is our self-esteem, our self-concept, right? So, and it dwells there in the subconscious, and only through the exploration and the willingness to draw it out and listen to it and have conversation with it, do we actually see it for it being something in and of itself, while yet not having, taking up real estate in our bodies, so to speak. So yeah, the ego is a collective of really who we are and what we've experienced.
Well, in Greek, the word ego actually means I. Like self, right? Your self-concept, your understanding of who you are. And so that makes perfect sense. It is I, the ego.
Yes.
And yes. So, so often when we hear ego, it's like you've got to, get rid of your ego, or he has such a big ego, or an inflated ego, or she is so egoic. And can we talk a little bit about, the wounded ego as opposed to the healed ego, or the developed ego, or the underdeveloped ego? Can you talk a little bit about what that means? Because the ego is on a spectrum, right? It's a continuum.
Yeah.
And so we're never going to get rid of it, correct?
No,
it's
and
always
so
going to be a part of us.
Yes, and so people are like, you have such an ego. It's like, well, yeah, I actually do, as do you, and you, and you, and you, right? Like having an ego is organic to being a human, right? The problem is that in our society, our understanding of ego has such a negative connotation to it because we don't understand the spectrum as you spoke to the ego, right? And so, just as the ego is I and who we are, the ego is really how we are perceiving ourselves. So when you talk about the wounded ego, right, we're talking about an ego that has received messages of scarcity and lack, right? And this typically comes from childhood. Maybe we have we're raised in homes where our caregivers were neglectful or spoke messages of being displeased with us, or we have moments of abandonment. We have little trauma with a little t, or trauma with a big T, right? So in those developmental stages, we started receiving messages within the ego of lack and of scarcity. So the wounded ego is really an ego that hurts, right? I mean, it really does view the world from a place of there is something wrong with me. So I love the best way of explaining it to people is that, Lisa, if I were to come to you and say, you know what, Lisa, you should really, think about shaving your head and getting a giant, anime figure tattooed on the top of it. I don't know why you haven't done that.
Okay. I'll do that. You read my mind.
Yeah, you're like, that's so weird. I had that already planned. There would be, typically, I would think, there would not be a part of you that would receive that from me and be harmed by that, right? Like you would respond just as I expected you to respond, with laughter, like that's ridiculous, right? Because your ego has never received a message that there's lack in you because of something, because you don't have this tattooed, bald head, right? So the wounded ego, would be wounded by something like that. If I were to say to you something along the lines about your writing or, your business practices or something like that, there would be a feeling of woundedness in that, right? Because our subconscious has experienced things within its collective experiences that may doubt our abilities. Maybe it's in childhood, we were told we were not good at something, or we shouldn't try out for something because we probably won't make it, or whatever, right? So the wounded ego is an ego that has areas of hurting its own feelings, right? So when people are like, you hurt my feelings, that's not really actually true. We're actually hurting our own feelings because our ego is receiving a message that we kind of believe, right? It's hitting something in our subconscious that we're like, ouch, maybe I'm not a good mom. Maybe there's something they're saying that's true. So the wounded ego is one that has subconscious I would say kind of like, Swiss cheese, holes in it, right? Where, the more holes there are, the more wounded the ego is, right?
So is it things that are close that we value? So as you gave the example of being a good mother and, that idea of, that there's the right way to mother, and, comparisons and families and friendship groups and, and you gave the example of my writing, and, that's something that's close to my heart, and it's such it's a vocation for me. It's not just a job. And so I hold that value very close, as do you as a mother, as an example. So is it typically something when our ego gets triggered? Is it when we feel that our identity, the things that we value in our identity, are being threatened?
Yes, and threatened by our own belief system, right? So it's actually not threatened by the other people, right? It's threatened by our own subconscious belief system that what if they are true, right?
So as an example, like if someone says, I don't know, as an example for me, like you're not a good cook. I'm like, well, I enjoy my food and it's keeping me alive. And, so obviously it's doing the job I need it to do. I'm sure there's worse cooks than I am. So it's not really going to trigger me.
Correct.
But if someone, as an example, if I go to someone and I say, here's my perception of what you did, a wounded ego would respond with anger. How dare you accuse me of that? How can you think that about me? And we'll see very often an adult temper tantrum.
Yes.
Typically. And whereas a healthy ego, a healed ego, a developed ego would say, oh, I'm really sorry that was your perception. Let's talk about it. Let's find a solution to this, because I never want you to feel like I would ever treat you in that manner. And I either need to do something different, or maybe your perception, we can discuss it and help us both see it from a different viewpoint. And that would be the response from a healthy ego. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so exactly. So a wounded ego is one where you're going to see those Freudian defense mechanisms, whether it's denial, projection, regression, right? So anything that comes in hurts, right? And it could be something that's a little hurt, like, your cooking isn't very good. Well, how dare somebody not like my cooking, like, to big hurts, things that we really value. So a wounded ego really values everything. Like they need to feel that they are good and they are worthy and that they are perfect at everything, right? Because if they're not, then it hurts. Right. Whereas a healthy ego understands that it has its insecurities, but it can speak truth to it. Right. So if somebody were to say to me, you know what, that's not something a good mom would do. A healed or a healthy ego would say, I can agree to disagree with you, because my parenting may look different than your parenting, and this is my space and this is my pace that I've chosen to raise my children in a safe and in a healthy way. Yours may look very different than mine, but for me and my children, this is what works for us, right? And we don't have to go into those defense mechanisms in order to protect. Really, that's what defense mechanisms do, is to protect ourselves, right? So wounded ego can look either way. It can look like extremely insecure and kind of be like, oh, you hurt my feelings, and we get kind of like this, withering away, and everybody hates me, let me eat worms. Or we can get this overly defensive. How dare you think there's anything wrong with me because everything I do turns to gold, right? And so when you talk about that spectrum, the wounded ego can sometimes start very insecure, and through very dysfunctional relationships and dysfunctional thinking turn into kind of like this overly inflated ego where nothing can penetrate it, right? Nothing can speak the truth to it, because that in and of itself is fragile as well.
So it's interesting because it sounds like from your description that the wounded ego, the underdeveloped, is actually very small, and it keeps its life very small because it has to protect it. And it probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, people with an underdeveloped ego would probably not be willing to take a lot of risks in their life. They'd be very rigid. They would keep a very small life, if you will.
Yes.
But their ego looks really big. Even though it's a very small life, their ego, because of the reasons that you said, they have to protect it. So how do we, I think to me, obviously it's easier to see an ego in someone else, an unhealthy ego, right? And I know for myself, there you go. And I know there's different aspects of my life where I feel very confident. My ego, I feel, is very healthy. If someone criticizes me in that area, I just kind of like, okay. I'm a strong believer in no one can accuse me of being very many things in an attack, because I'll own it. I'm like, sure. Yeah, I can be petulant. I can be, my ego can get triggered, but I'm always trying to learn and to grow and to improve. And I always try to lead with my heart. So I know for me, when my wounded ego is showing, I'm leading not with my heart.
Correct. Yeah.
Trying to get something, trying to impress, trying to control. That's typically is my ego showing.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I'm taking the reins here. Yeah, that type of thing. So can you speak to how we recognize ego in ourselves, and then also what we do when we recognize a wounded ego in other people?
Well, I love that you are bringing that up, because you said something, you're like, when I start noticing, I start trying to change something in myself to please somebody else. So a wounded ego, it does show up like kind of in these really kind of small, meek ways, but then also in these giant, bold ways. And so really, when we're talking about, psychopathology, and we're working with individuals on how we can heal the ego, on one end of the spectrum, when we're coming from a place of insecurity and we need, so much validation and affirmation, we're typically talking about like codependent behaviors, right? So I'm going to change what I think, feel, and do in order to get somebody else to change and give me what I need, right? Because my ego is so wounded that I need them to be the ones to make me feel valuable and worthy, right? So, that's a very insecure, wounded ego, right? And then on the other side of the spectrum, right, we end up seeing the psychopathology of like narcissism and sociopathy, and not antisocial, that's something totally different, but histrionic and those types of personality cluster B personality disorders, which actually do come from a very insecure place, right? But they are no longer willing to be vulnerable to what other people think, feel, and do, right? Like they've kind of shut down, and it's like only what I think, feel, and do matters. But that still comes from a very insecure, a very wounded ego place. Like the ego is so protective at that point that it's like only my way matters, and because that's the only way I can protect my ego, right? So a healthy ego is when you come together and you can recognize, oh, I'm noticing that I'm changing what I think and do to try and control somebody else's behaviors. That's not healthy. So let me come back to myself. And like you said, my ego is what's telling me, am I being true to am I being true? Am I listening to a true story? Or is this a story that is from my past, is from my subconscious, and it no longer serves me? And when we listen to that part of the ego, we have to be like, okay, no, I know who you are. That's probably mom, or that's probably, that teacher or whatever that made me feel that way, right? So if we're on one end of the spectrum and we're trying to change ourselves to get something out of somebody else, we're in that codependency, insecure ego. But then if we're on the other end of the spectrum, we're in an insecure, wounded ego where we are no longer available to take perspective of anything other than just what we think, feel, and do, right? So you can see on both sides, both are completely unhealthy because they have zero perspective taking.
That's interesting, because so often we think of, someone who's on that far end of the spectrum of, trying to control, but it's all control, right? Even the one on the other spectrum,
It is, yeah.
it is all control. And so I think we can often, once again, recognize the wounded ego in other people. And with self-work and self-exploration, we can learn to recognize it in ourselves. But what does a healthy ego look like?
A healthy ego is so beautiful, right? And a healthy ego is really what we should be striving for in our parenting, partnership, and peers, right? What that really means is we can show up and we can be present with people, right? A healthy ego knows how to be present and actually fully receive. And then with that fully receiving, can fully give, right? And why that's important is because if we show up with unhealthy ego, all right, we show up in the here and now, maybe needing to talk about the dishes needing to be done, right? But if we are in a wounded ego, we're trying to talk about the dishes, but we're talking about everything from the past. You know what? I need you to do dishes. You never do them. You never have, right? It's always on me, blah, 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 right? And then, on the flip side, you have this whole other story. Like, you should be doing the dishes because you're the one that's home more, blah, blah, blah. A healthy ego knows how to show up in the present and say, hey, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but the dishes have been piling up. We both have very, very busy schedules. And so what do you think might be a solution or two solutions that we can come up with to start keeping these humming along, so neither one of us feel like we are, solely responsible for taking care of the household management? That's a very different conversation that has no judgment, no shame, no projection in it. And a healthy ego is really the only place that you can have those conversations in all areas of our lives, right?
So would you say that a healthy ego is very solution focused?
Yes. Very solution focused and very open to solutions from others as well.
So it's not a matter of it's you and me against each other. It's you and me against a problem. Right?
Exactly.
Trying to find a solution to a problem. Do you find that people with that wounded ego, that they have a tendency to abandon situations, to not they tend to lack follow through or completion? What are some of the consequences of
Mhm.
allowing a wounded ego to remain unhealed? Like, what does it look like as far as actions go?
I think one of the saddest things about having a wounded ego and never really doing ego work, which I think is the greatest gift you can give yourself, right? Because, 94% of us are coming from childhoods where we have had something projected upon us, right? There's only 6 to 7% of us out there with secure attachments, and good luck finding any of them, right? So the reality is that most of us are showing up with wounded egos in some way, shape, or form, right? So by doing the healing work, what we're really doing is coming to a place where we can be present with our partners, peers, and in our parenting. And what was the question?
I appreciate the looking for clarity.
We froze for a second, and I was like, "Oh, Lisa's frozen," and then I was like, "Oh, I'm just staring at her now."
That's all right, because this is every conversation, right?
Yes,
These
yeah.
are the exciting conversations. We don't always have control over what happens, and our egos can handle it.
That's right. Our ego, you know what? We don't let our ego say there's anything wrong with that.
Exactly, because we're showing up with healthy egos here.
Right.
So I was curious what it looks like when it goes unhealed, and because I think very often, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think very often that we think it looks like well, out of control dictators and that type of thing. We think that is what an unhealed ego looks like, right, on these large scale media fueled stories. But in reality, it's a day-to-day, every person experience.
It is.
So yeah, and so how would it look? Would an unhealed ego in a relationship look? What would that look like? Like, what would the actions look like moving forward if they continue on that route?
Yeah, and that is the everyday ego that shows up, right? Is in those friendships and those partnerships. And so it too is like a spectrum. It can show up in being extremely inhibited, right? So maybe very passive aggressive. So I'm not going to talk about something, but I'm going to, in a microaggressive way, comment about something. So it's, inhibition, micro comments. It could look like projection, I'm angry about, burning dinner, but I'm going to yell at you about not taking the trash out, right? It shows up as, turbulence, right? So something like cutting us off, all of a sudden we're cussing this person out, and, our kids in the back, kind of being like, what's going on here? It can show up as being egotistic, right? Like it's hard for us to listen to other people's perspectives and points of view. Finger pointing, that's a big thing. Hey, it really hurt my feelings that you did this. Well, I wouldn't have hurt your feelings if you had done this, right? So we see these very, very toxic behaviors in relationships, in friendships, in parenting. I mean, these are everyday behaviors that we see and we hear about from our friends that are very, very damaging to relationships, right? And unfortunately, what that does is if we're not aware of our own ego work, or the fact that maybe our partner has some ego work that they need to do, it starts poking more holes into that ego, right? And it starts making us believe messages that really aren't true. And that's why it's so important to do your own ego work. It is not your partner's responsibility to do your ego work. It is yours, right? So that you can show up. And if somebody starts pointing the finger at you and you're like, wait a minute, time out. Hey, I was really trying to talk about something that I was uncomfortable with. However, what I'm receiving from you is something that doesn't feel good because it's not really about this conversation, And so that gives us the language of having healthy boundaries and having healthy conversations that really stay focused on the present. And we're no longer available for these facets of wounded egos.
Would you say that, in the therapeutic term, vernacular, the terms is, as ego work, that in the spiritual metaphysical area, would it be termed shadow work? Are they interchangeable? So it's all the same thing.
Yeah, and I love that. And I want you to speak to this too, because I think in our culture, and it's not the same with all cultures, but I do think a lot of cultures do see the shadow and the light. But all of these pieces that come out of us when we feel wounded, so even say something like inhibition, right? If we're very inhibited, the shadow of that is that we don't speak our mind, right? We don't speak up for something, and we can be passive aggressive and, project at times. That's the shadow of that wounded ego. Now, when we heal that part of our ego, it turns into the light, right? So every facet has a light piece too. And what that means is that we are going to be less impulsive in just saying things. We're going to be a lot more mindful, right? So inhibited in the light can be called mindful, right? So all of these facets, really have a spiritual giftedness to them. I mean, they were really given to us from the divine, right? But in our own experiences and our own development of self-esteem and the stories we've allowed other people to tell us that are not true, the shadow is a piece that is more easily believable, right, than the light. But as we become healthy, we recognize, no, I am not a shadow being. I really am a light being. And so I choose to live on that side of the ego story and not the shadow.
I find, and please speak to this, I find that once you successfully heal one aspect of your wounding in any area, you then have it as a touchstone to return to. Like, I've done this, I know what this is, I recognize what's the light, like as you just described, on the other side of it. And I wouldn't say the healing gets easier, but it gets, the action steps become very noticeable, and you can recognize them as you're moving forward. So for listeners and for anyone wanting to do this work, would you say just pick one?
Yes.
Just one area that you want to, whether it's your work life or your relationship, just pick one.
Yes.
Heal a friendship, heal, your relationship with your body, whatever it is, just pick one. And then it gets easier and easier as you move.
Oh, it does. It does. Because, honestly, the process is the same. And, being a therapist and people come into therapy, I mean, they got their lists of things that they want to work on, right? And especially when I do couples work, I'm like, woo, okay, so we're going to narrow this down to 2 or 3 objectives, right, that we're going to really focus on. And even within those, we have to look at the facets of the ego, right? And so I think, like what you said is do not, because what we can do is build a story of shame. Okay, well, I'm trying to work on all of these things, and look, I couldn't even succeed at this one thing, right? So if you're recognizing that part of your ego work is that, you tend to, do a lot of projecting when somebody comes at you and you hurt your own feelings in your ego. And so you project, so they say something about, I think you parked your car the wrong way. And you're like, well, you know what? I think that I don't like what you wore today. That looks awful. Why are you wearing that? Right? If you are recognizing one facet of one part of a relationship, whether it's work, relationship, friendship, if you're noticing something and you notice it because ultimately it doesn't feel good to you, right? There's a part of you that's like, I don't like the way I feel when I react that way. Pick that one area and start doing the work around, why am I responding this way? What is it that I'm telling myself is true when somebody says X, Y, and Z to me? And so, if you can heal one facet, then like you said, when you recognize, here's something I've noticed I'm doing, right? I'm avoiding. As soon as this is said to me, I push back and I'm like, nope, I'm not gonna, nope. You know what? This isn't for me. I'm not I don't want to be part of this, blah, blah, blah. As soon as that one thing is said, okay, what is it about that one thing that's being said to me that is causing me to avoid, to do the shadow work, right? And so we really look at it facet by facet by facet. And ultimately what we bring ourselves to is what I call neutral energy. We can sit in the discomfort with others and not own it as our own.
So from as your description, everything, it just webs out. It improves your boundary setting. It improves your goal setting. It improves your relationship with self as well as with others. So it really does just web out to all aspects of your life, correct?
Yeah. And something I want to ask you is, it's like when people say, because I've told you this before, like, I just love your energy. You've got really good energy, right? What do you think it is people are kind of picking up on with that?
I have no idea. No, just kidding. I think, I'm human and I make a lot of errors and misstep, but I really believe that I believe in growth. I think I'm a naturally curious person. And I think, so when I meet someone, as an example, like you and I having a conversation, I'm listening. I'm very excited to hear what you have to share. And my mind is always like, oh, I like that. I'm going to find. So I think I lead with that. But I think, and I do truly believe that people know when you have an agenda. They feel it, people I know, for me, if I have an agenda with someone, they feel it from me. I am an empath. I've always been an empath. I now admit I'm an empath.
Do you have your card now that you keep in your wallet? You're like, and here you go.
Here's my card. And being an empath, I feel energy. And so I can respond to people's energy. And that be able to, if I feel that they're agitated, I can help them feel calmer, and I can adjust to that. And so thank you for that lovely, feedback. That's always
compliment
nice
that you didn't know I was going to give you,
but I appreciate it and I take it in. Now, I do have to say, if I start thinking that I'm, infallible with that, well, that's my ego.
Sure.
And, and so I think so often we see people who are light workers in the spiritual field, in the health, the healing field, and they think they have all the answers.
Correct.
And if I ever think I have all the answers, I know it's my ego, and I know I need to check myself.
Yeah, girl, before you wreck yourself. And I'll tell you what I picked up on already, just within our interactions, is that you can sit in what I call neutral energy, right? And empaths tend to be targets oftentimes from people who have wounded egos, because they feel like they can be easily manipulated, which they can, right? However, if you're an empath that has done the healing work of an ego, of the ego, watch out, because it's a superpower. Because you know how to sit in all of the feelings and you be okay, right? You might feel somebody's feelings, you might absorb somebody's feelings, but you know how to be, you yourself be okay. And I'll say that something that I really loved about this exchange today is that, and why I feel like what a beautiful topic to talk about ego between the two of us, is there was no interrupting of each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
So ego work, interrupting. Can I stop you right there? Can I just, tell you one thing right there? Oh, that's right there. The give and the take and the social reciprocity of listening, receiving, responding. That's a really, really, really good marker for healthy ego.
And, and I do have to say, there were times where I had a thought and I would find myself trying to, and I was like, it's not finished, and take a step back. And that's okay too.
It is.
Being able to recognize that, it wasn't, any ego aspect. It was just, reading
excitement. It was excitement.
Exactly. Enthusiasm. And we all have that, right? And
right.
I think so often, people say, well, you should do this or you shouldn't do that. And it's completely you have to know the context of a situation. You have to know that. And I also have to say, I've been in situations where my ego is being triggered. And
100%.
I am a bulldog when that happens. And I recognize that in myself. And, people who have never seen that in me, when I say that, they're like, oh, Lisa, I'm like, oh no. Oh no, I'm scrappy, and I will come at you. And
I've seen it. I've seen
it. And that's my ego, and it is. And I think, as we move forward with the ego project and explore all of these aspects of the ego, where ego and parenting, ego and friendships, and ego and relationships, and ego and aging. I mean,
and ego in leadership, where it's okay to be an alpha female and have a healthy ego,
and what that looks like. And especially since we have lived under a patriarchal system for so long, and the models that we have are very often alpha male, and alpha masculine. And so I'm excited to see that, and I'm excited to explore this with you, to see where it takes us. I know I've learned so much today, and I look forward to all of our conversations moving forward, and how that shows itself. And I do want to say, the thing that I so admire in you is you are unapologetic in your drive and your ambition. And it's not egoic. It's like, I have skills, I have abilities, and I want to be of service to the world. And I don't care if you think I should be doing something else. And I so love that. And it's such a, it's a beautiful model for people. And, I admire it so much. So I am so excited about this partnership.
Me too. Too. Yeah. So we need everybody to subscribe. We need everybody to follow us. And, honestly, I think we could talk about ego forever.
And we might. And when we've taken it too far, our ego will tell us.
Hey, dial it back.
And we want to say to everyone out there, we want your feedback. Share with us, where you see your ego. If there's topics of ego you want us to explore, we are open to that. So please do not hesitate. Give us your feedback. Share with your friends. We really want to help, open this up to discussion. So,
Yeah, and let people know that, again, like ego and personality and all of those things are within a spectrum, right? And that just kind of like circles all the way back around from the beginning of the conversation. It's important to know and to understand ego so that we are not mislabeling, that we are not misspeaking about people by calling them things like a narcissist or a sociopath and all of those things, if they just because they have some patterns or behaviors that have not been healed. Let's give them the opportunity to learn that they don't have to navigate from the shadow, right? That they can work through in the light. But the more we call people these names and the more we use the vernacular of shame and judgment for something that they probably are so unaware of because it's from the subconscious, the more we're like kind of cheating them out of being able to live like really happy, healthy lives with peers, partners, and in their parenting. So,
well, and I also believe that hearing other people claim their ego gives people permission to claim their own, and you and I, we claim our ego, we recognize it, and we recognize areas that are wounded and areas that we want to heal, and that we're working on, and it gives people permission to do that. So please, everyone out there, show us your ego. We want to see it. This is the ego project. So
you'll see ours 100%. It'll come out.
Oh, you're going to see it. Trust me, you're going to see it. And, and you're also going to see and hear ways that we navigate it, we heal it, we recognize it, we learn how to give space to it, and we make friends with it.
Yeah, it's only there. Yep, our ego is there to protect us, right? And so sometimes it tells us a story that we're not safe when we really are. So we just have to listen to it and ask it what it's trying to tell us, and then say thank you and release it.
Great. And can you offer any action steps as we finish up, for the listeners out there and for everyone, of how, one action step that they can take this week to work on their ego?
Yeah, so 100%. So I would say, my one thing would pick one area of your life, whether it's a relationship, a friendship, a colleague at work, whatever. Look at that exchange and identify one area that you feel really triggered, because when we say triggered, teens love that word for a while. It was like their favorite word. When you feel triggered, that is your ego communicating something to you. So take note of it. Write down, what is this trigger? What is it saying? What is it feeling like? Because that's where we can go to your ego and figure out what that little Swiss cheese hole is, right? So one relationship, one statement, one triggering moment, write it down, send it to us, and maybe we'll have some time to process through it.
Oh, that'd be great. And, as we progress forward, with the Ego Project, we'll be taking your questions. And so, if you want to get a jump on that, feel free to add those in the comments as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's our email address, Lisa?
It is egoprojectconnect@gmail.com.
Yes,
and
email us.
Yes, and it is on our YouTube page as well. You can find that.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you, Lisa. You're always such a, I would just talk to you all day long, but I can't.
Oh, I'm sure we could.
I got this whole JOB thing I got to do.
We actually have to get out there in the world.
I know. All right. Well, I will. Yeah, I know. Girl gotta eat. I will see you next time. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Cristine. All right. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.